Nightmare on Elm Street 5, The Dream Child opened just under a year after the massively successful fourth film, The Dream Master, which grossed over 7 times its production budget. The third installment in the series, The Dream Warriors, elevated the nightmare sequences into new territory and dived further into the black humor of the series' antagonist, Freddy Krueger. The film became a fan favorite, with some even preferring it over the original. This led future installments to increasingly amp up the dream scenes into even greater surreal and frightening territory. The success of A Nightmare on Elm Street 4 led the next film to be fast-tracked by New Line Cinema. This is while the Amazing Freddy's Nightmares television series was also going on at this point. Pre-production for The Dream Child was very difficult with an ever-changing script, and compounded with that, director Stephen Hopkins wasn't given the time or money to complete the film to his satisfaction. A year after its release, he said in an interview, quote, "It was a rush schedule without a reasonable budget, and after I finished it, New Line and the MPAA came in and cut the guts out of it completely. What started out as an okay film with a few good bits turned into a total embarrassment. I can't even watch it anymore," unquote. It's a shame he felt this way, because to me, A Nightmare on Elm Street 5 is a franchise at its all-time creative high. While I am a fan of The Final Nightmare and New Nightmare, today, over 30 years after the release of The Dream Child, the Elm Street series has never been directed in such a stylish and uniquely visual way. Dream Master protagonist Alice Johnson, played wonderfully by Lisa Wilcox, who I'll talk more about in a little, returns along with her high school sweetheart Dan Jordan, played by Danny Hassel. Alice has a dream about being a nun, Amanda Krueger, trapped in an insane asylum and is then attacked by the patients. Right off the bat, the film already shows some of its more gothic tone and production design, something very intentional by the director. For the first time since the murder of her friends and brother 1 year ago, Alice is starting to feel like she's not in control. We're then introduced to 3 new characters: Yvonne Miller, a volunteer candy striper at the local Springwood Hospital, a member of the school's diving team, and Alice's best friend. Greta Gibson, a reluctant model with an implied eating disorder who's being pressured by her mother into pursuing this as her career path. And finally, Mark Gray, an artist and comic book geek with a fear of blood and a crush on Greta. They're all very likable, but Greta, played by Erica Anderson, probably has some of the most substantial thematic aspects to her character. We unfortunately don't get to spend too much time with her, but it seems very obvious modeling is something she's just doing to appease her mother. And this is just an inference based on my understanding of the situation, but I don't think it'd be a stretch to guess Racine, her mother, is living vicariously through her. Just one of the many issues teens and young adults face that is conveyed in this movie. Another returning character is Dennis Johnson, Alice's father. This is the only time in the series we see positive growth for any of the parental figures. In The Dream Master, he's a neglectful, verbally abusive alcoholic who can't deal with the death of his wife, and he takes his frustrations out on his children. In this film, he's since become sober and seems to be more present and supportive of Alice. But what I like about this is it's realistic and not a night and day difference between the two movies. He's loving, but in his own standoffish way. He's shown to be a bit cold toward Dan in the only interaction they have in the film. The loss of his son and Alice's brother Rick obviously had an impact on him, but he still feels like the same person, only he's been working on changing his behavior. And overall, the acting is one of the biggest strengths this film has going for it. Like most lower budgeted horror films, there's some moments of not so great ADR, but other than that, everyone does a great job. Alice began as a secondary character in the previous movie and was very shy, but now that her character is established, Lisa Wilcox really gets to show off her acting chops, and her character has so much to do. Alice calls Dan from work to tell him that she's scared after having had another dream, so he quickly leaves their high school graduation party to get to her, but unfortunately, on the way, he falls asleep while driving. And this is where my favorite death in the entire franchise begins. After having been temporarily defeated by Alice, Freddy clearly wants his revenge, and the amount of resentment he holds toward them is perfectly showcased in this scene. He absolutely ravages Dan. This nightmare is so elongated and filled with shocking imagery. There's a bottle of champagne Dan had for Alice, and the freakish way Freddy pours it on his arm and it reacts like acid, followed by him tearing his arm off at the shoulder and using it as a seatbelt, is terrifying. And this is just the beginning. Dan, with his arms trapped by seatbelts, only narrowly avoids crashing into oncoming traffic when he's then thrown through the windshield and suddenly appears right back where he started. He gets on a motorcycle, and then the terror just starts all over again in one of the most inventive death scenes I could think of in any horror movie. Freddy possesses the bike and merges it with Dan, disfiguring him and turning him into a half-man, half-motorcycle hybrid. Unfortunately, some of the gore was cut out of this part by the MPAA, which really showed just how painful this would be. Finally, in the real world, Dan wakes up just moments before colliding head-on with the semi-truck, and he finally meets his demise. This is just one of many more scenes that show off Stephen Hopkins' extraordinary directing talent. Only 3 people are murdered by Freddy in this film, and all 3 sequences are outstanding. So I've talked about the acting and the directing. What else makes this a great movie? Every Elm Street film tackles some deeper issues such as child neglect or repressed homosexuality. This film grapples with teen pregnancy but comes at it from multiple angles. Alice is pregnant and realizes Freddy is using her unborn child as a conduit to go after her friends, and there's a very sweet scene between her and Mark where he asks her if she's considered all her options. What I like is the film doesn't condemn abortion. It wasn't planned, but the baby is a part of Dan, so she simply wants to have it, and Mark, who handles this exchange perfectly, smiles and assures her they'll find another way then. In another scene, Alice asks her father if he's disappointed in her, which is a feeling many teens would struggle with in her situation, but he tells her he is not. And finally, another example is when Dan's parents tell Alice they want custody of the baby and threaten legal action if necessary, and Dennis stands by his daughter and tells them to basically fuck off.
We got a call from Dr. Moore. He said that Alice was hysterical and that she was having paranoid delusions.
You don't understand.
We know you've been through a lot. But there is more at stake here than just your feelings.
You're not taking my baby.
Well, the courts might not agree with you.
But I do. And I've heard enough of this crap. You think you could just walk into my house and threaten my daughter?
The scene is handled tastefully, and Dan's parents feel like real grieving people and not just evil caricatures. Alice has to be very strong throughout this film and really be on it. If she could even manage to survive, there's a chance she could lose this baby in a custody battle. The next thing I want to touch on is the music. Every Elm Street film has a great, memorable score, but in my opinion, The Dream Child is the standout, and I would say personally that it's the best since the original. The music was composed by Jay Ferguson, and this would actually be the last film score he would do. The movie has a nice blend of low-key creepiness, and I would even say beauty. Big, bombastic, gothic-inspired pieces. Straight-up synth bops. And some groovy heavy metal. This stuff is leagues above some of the other horror movies coming out around this time. So I'm not going to break down the entire film beat by beat because I can't recommend it enough for anyone watching who may not have seen it, but there is just a couple more standout moments I want to touch on that help solidify the movie as so much more than the simple cash grab some people seem to think it is. I mentioned earlier how all the characters are likable. Dan's death is the most tragic to me in the series, even more so than Nancy's because of the weight it holds. Krueger left Alice a single mother, and Dan was a good guy for the time we had him. Mark is the first to take Alice seriously once the murders begin, and he's a really good friend. One of my least favorite tropes in horror films, especially slashers, is purposefully annoying, obnoxious characters. I don't want to be rooting for people to be killed, I want to be rooting for their survival. In some slasher movies, it makes absolutely no sense that the group we're following would ever actually hang out with each other, like in The Graveyard, Friday the 13th Part 7, Offerings. The Dream Child, like all the Elm Street films, is great at building sympathetic characters in short amount of time. Freddy torments Mark by making fun of the fact he murdered Greta, whom he loves. I find this heartbreaking personally, and it's enough to set Mark over the edge, becoming the Phantom Prowler. But unfortunately, even he is no match for Freddy, and Mark is literally ripped to shreds inside his own comic book world. And before my closing thoughts, I have to talk about the ending because it is so insane, and I mean that in the best possible way. Yvonne searches for the remains of Amanda Krueger in order to set her spirit free. Meanwhile, Alice willingly seeks out Freddy since she has no choice but to face him head on. There's some disturbing body horror when Krueger emerges from Alice essentially being birthed. But Jacob, who's been fed the souls of his mother's dead friends, uses Freddy's own powers against him, and with the help of Amanda, he's put back where he came from. So this is just such out of this world thinking. Alice communicates with her unborn child in her dreams, and she's even named him already. We see Freddy disappear into his mother's womb, which clearly hurts her physically and mentally, making her character all the more tragic. Then Jacob turns into a baby and becomes one with his mother again. I can't get over this imagery. It's so sweet how Alice and her child are already supporting one another and willing to fight for each other. I can't think of many other slasher films with this kind of out-of-the-box thinking. It's a lot smarter than people give it credit for. We cut to 9 months later and have one last but quick scene of Alice holding little baby Jacob and spending time with Auntie Yvonne and Grandpa Dennis. As usual, there's the last little tease to let you know Freddy's never truly gone, but it's vague enough that you could view this chapter closed. You can theorize that John Doe in the final nightmare is grown-up Jacob since he was originally the protagonist, but this isn't officially canonized in the movie as we know it. The Dream Child was the lowest grossing film of the franchise at the time of its release, and considering New Nightmare is a different timeline set in the real world of the filmmakers, that would make Elm Street 5 the least successful traditional Freddy Krueger movie. Along with that, it received mixed reviews at best, with some critics being plain scathing toward it, such as this one by Jonathan Rosenbaum of the Chicago Reader, who called the directing inept and the editing flaccid, which is so far off the mark. 5 words I'd use to describe A Nightmare on Elm Street 5 are inventive, energetic, thoughtful, scary, and genuine. If you've avoided it due to word of mouth or haven't given it a watch in some years, I highly suggest a reevaluation of this underappreciated horror film.